Welcome to Everything History. I have a bit of an announcement before this show, because while I intended to complete the American Revolution with Part 2 today, I found I had more than enough information and story for 3 parts. So the episode you listen to today is Part 2 of 3 on the American Revolution. And with that, let the show begin.
I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Welcome back to Everything History for Part 2 of my explanation of the American Revolution. If you haven't listened to the first part, don't worry, you can still keep up and tag along. After this episode, though, I would implore you to go back and listen to Part 1 to gain a full understanding. That being said, I left off midway into the year 1770, shortly after the so-called Boston Massacre. It's sad to look back on the Boston Massacre because it's quite apparent that it was a propaganda play by the Sons of Liberty. 5 people died because a radical group of colonists wanted everyone else to hate the British Redcoats. I'm not defending the killing of the townsfolk, but I am saying it was self-defense by the British, and the courts agreed. The Sons of Liberty had hoped the massacre would move the public opinion needle in their favor, but all it really did was give loyalists and regular colonists reason to dislike the rebellious radicals even more. Some will still argue that the Boston Massacre still had some effect, and I do not entirely denounce such an argument. It did have an impact, especially in Britain where merchants worried of riots in the colonial port cities. Yet to assert that the repeal of the Townshend Act's taxes, besides the tax on tea, remember, was heavily related to the Boston Massacre is a step too far. Parliament had already been debating the matter previous to the March 5th incident, and Benjamin Franklin himself said, "I rather think the apprehension of an approaching war inclined the British government to milder measures." That being said, by the summer of 1770, everything seemed back to normal throughout the colonies. Even Boston seemed at ease with the renewed unity with their mother country. Nevertheless, the Sons of Liberty did not give up the fight. They continued to pursue the hope of revolution. After reading a dozen opinions from historians on the Boston Massacre, this is my spin on the event. The failure of the Boston Massacre was actually the best thing to happen to colonial radicals. That seems counterintuitive because it had failed, that is obviously apparent, but it taught them a lot about how to properly manipulate events in order to garner more support. This is just like in sports where losing can be the best thing to happen to a team. In other words, the radicals, who were soon to be called patriots, were now learning how to create propaganda. However, they needed an opportunity to truly grasp the spotlight and hopefully rebrand themselves. In 1772, Parliament gave them that chance. Lord North's government in England appeared intent on steering the empire into perilous political waters again when they passed 2 enactments on their American colonies. The first stripped the colonies' power to pay the salaries of royal governors, judges, and other high officials. This was seen as an affront to the colonies because threatening to reduce or withhold salaries had been a common practice to rein in their royal governors. The second act authorized Parliament in Britain to have Americans accused of destroying British ships put to trial back in England. Naturally, the Americans saw this as a breach of their liberties, so how did the colonies respond? I find their response absolutely hilarious and tactically brilliant. Immediately after, members of the Sons of Liberty in Rhode Island boarded and burned the English HMS Gaspee. So basically, the American extremists just called out Lord North's Parliament. Britain responded by ordering the royal governor and his officials to seek out the perpetrators of the incident and announced that any suspects found to be involved with the burning of the HMS Gaspee would be tried for treason back in England itself. This proved to be an empty threat, though, because no suspects were to be found, and the threat only hardened the radicals' resolve. The fact that no suspects were brought up for charges tells us several new things about the American situation. Primarily what it says is that the crisis between Great Britain and America was alive again. And for those of you keeping track, that is the 3rd time tensions have escalated between the two. The first being after the Stamp Act, the second being the Townshend Acts, and now the third after Parliament threatened treason trials and removed colonial control over governor salaries. I mentioned treason there rather lightly, but let's try and keep this honest, even as Americans. Burning royal ships like the Gaspee under the Royal Navy's flag is indeed treason. It's also terrorism as well, just a form of terrorism that appears patriotic in retrospect. I say that to simply put things in perspective, and it's good practice when learning about the American Revolution to not just view everything from the American point of view. That being said, many colonials did take notice of the Gaspee incident. Many in the southern colonies saw it as too forceful and aggressive, but almost all of the central and northern colonies saw it as an act of colonial patriotism. Thus I would point to the burning of the Gaspee in 1772 as the moment colonial radicals such as the Sons of Liberty rebranded themselves as patriots. That being the case, I will now refer to those colonial radicals as patriots. Moving on, the situation in America gets still more interesting by the fall of 1772. The patriots realized they had the advantage of public support and sought to build on their gains by constructing a network of patriot groups in every colony that would report on their colony and its happenings. I really have to take my hat off to the patriots at this point because this move was brilliant. This network is now known as the Committees of Correspondence. The first Committee of Correspondence was headquartered in Boston and chaired by John Hancock. The patriots spread word of the new citizen assembly in a leaflet called the Boston Pamphlet. The pamphlet was split into 3 parts. The first addressed the rights of the colonists, the second the violation of those rights, and the last was a letter of correspondence. The final section of the Boston Pamphlet asked other colonies and cities to follow suit and relay their doings back to the Boston Committee. The idea caught fire immediately, with hundreds of towns in Massachusetts forming committees that reported back to Boston. John Hancock, Samuel Adams, and Benjamin Church then began a secret campaign to create more committees. After a few months of British and American tensions still remaining high, Virginia was the next to commit. Churchill describes the development by saying, "The Virginian agitators, led by the young Patrick Henry, created a standing committee to keep in touch with other colonies, and a chain of such bodies was quickly formed. Thus the machinery of revolt was quietly and efficiently created." End quote. The leading members of Virginia's Committee of Correspondence were Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and South Carolina followed right after by forming their own committees. By May of 1774, all of the 13 colonies had set up committees of correspondence. I know what you're thinking. Thomas, isn't that about enough talk about these committees? And I say, not yet. I'll explain my reasoning, though. I'm focusing in on the committees because they would be the foundation for the initial government of the United States of America. In fact, the First Continental Congress would be almost entirely made up of the leading members from their colonies' committees. As you might imagine, the members of these colonial committees were primarily wealthy white men. More important than all of that, though, is how the Committees of Correspondence began to function within the American colonies. The colonies had since the mid-17th century essentially been able to govern themselves. Every colony had a colonial assembly, laws were well established, militias were ready, commerce was set, and the economy was able to function with very little English oversight by the end of the 17th century. The Committees of Correspondence built on that governmental groundwork in America and began to operate as a shadow government. A shadow government is essentially a government within a government that had the real power and influence. A shadow government is essentially a government within a government that has the real power and influence. In this case, the colonies were governed by royal governors and parliament, but in reality by 1773, 1774, the Committees of Correspondence were beginning to become the real governing force in the colonies. They had members and informants throughout thousands of towns and villages across the seaboard, and this will play a pivotal role later on in protecting patriot radicals in such incidents as the Boston Tea Party and Paul Revere's Ride. I'm getting ahead of myself, though, so let's turn the clock back to the beginning of summer of 1773. At this point in the American crisis, only 6 colonies had formed committees of correspondence of their own. Thus, despite the creation of the committees, the Patriot cause had yet to gain favor outside of Massachusetts. They would need assistance in some shape or form in order to gain favor throughout the colonies. Lucky for them, Lord North's government seemed intent on handing out another boon to the Patriot cause. This boon to the Patriots was a parliamentary blunder, called the Tea Act of 1773. The Tea Act was passed because the East India Company had fallen on hard economic times and was threatening to crumble. This was seen as a threat to the empire's overall economy, so Parliament passed the Tea Act that reduced the price of East India Company tea in order to outsell the competition. This once again created a divide in the colonies. Many colonists saw the justification in the act and supported Lord North's administration, but the majority of colonists went into a frenzy. The colonists, even those not endeared to the Patriots, were angry that Parliament had again, for the 4th time, attempted to manipulate colonial policy and economics. Not to mention this act was provoked by the bankruptcy of the East India Company, which had long been despised throughout Great Britain's colonies. Surprisingly, Parliament actually showed some foresight this time around. They expected a strong backlash in America and even predicted boycotts. They knew this would likely occur and sought to circumvent such colonial unrest by having merchants throughout America's port cities buy tea shipments through third-party members. These third-party men were essentially co-signers to tea shipments, and Parliament figured this would help because it would help disguise which merchants bought the tea, and it would bring in money for the East India Company. That was the plan anyways, and it appeared to work for a few weeks, even months. Despite the renewed colonial boycotts, East India Company tea was still making shipments into America. The Sons of Liberty wisened up, though, and knew they needed a more aggressive enforcement of boycotting English tea. Making sure the boycotts of English tea were successful became paramount to Patriot leaders. The Committees of Correspondence began to not only enforce the tea boycotts in the ports, but on the seas. They had begun to predict and figure out how East India tea was still entering their colonies. I could paraphrase or summarize how the Patriots conducted their systematic boycott, but I'm going to let David Ramsay explain it. Quote, "As the time approached when the arrival of the tea shipments might be soon expected, such measures were adopted as seemed most likely to prevent the landing of their cargoes. The tea co-signees, appointed by the East India Company, were in several places compelled to relinquish their appointments, and no others could be found hardy enough to act in their stead. The pilots in the river Delaware were warned not to conduct any tea ships into their harbor. In New York, popular vengeance was denounced against all those who would contribute in any measure to forward the views of the East India Company. The captains of the ships, being apprised of the resolutions of the people, concluded to directly return to Great Britain." Thereafter it is said that no East India Company tea made it into the colonies to be sold. Lord North, Parliament, and King George were absolutely shocked by the unity the colonies were showing in their resistance. There were still loyalist supporters in the colonies, this is true, but the Patriots now had the voice of the people. Every colony, every major city outside of a handful of southern cities were now steadfast supporters of the Patriot cause. Popular vengeance, as David Ramsay said, was all the rage in America as the end of 1773 approached. As it happens, though, there would be a patriotic finale in December of 1773. Britain and the East India Company were determined to see their tea sold in the colonies, and sought to teach the colonists a lesson by importing tea into Boston itself. The tea arrived by naval escort in late November, and Samuel Adams had a plan. Take the story I'm about to tell you, though, with a grain of salt, because it's so deeply embedded in American lore that much of the story is likely superfluous. This is the Boston Tea Party, and there are at least 9 different accounts. I will give you a mix of the accounts. On the night of December 16th, a group of the Sons of Liberty had a meeting to decide how to rid Boston of the tea annoyance. John Hancock and Samuel Adams presided over this meeting. After much deliberation, Samuel Adams decided on a course of action. He and a group of volunteers dressed themselves as Native Americans and ran through the streets to the docks. They must have did it rather loudly, though, because the Boston Gazette said in their report that the group was, quote, "followed by hundreds of people to see the event." I know what you're thinking, though. Thomas, why are so many Bostonians out of bed to watch this act of treason? Well, I hear you, but in reality, it was only 9 o'clock in the evening. Anyways, in the space of a couple hours, the party is said to have destroyed all 342 crates of tea from 3 separate vessels, amounting to some 92,000 pounds of destroyed product. In today's money, that is somewhere between $700,000 to $1 million in property damages. While Americans see the Boston Tea Party as some awesome patriotic event, the British, rightly so I might add, saw it as a massive act of treason. Great Britain hardened their resolve towards the colonies and responded by unleashing a series of binding enactments in 1774. Benjamin Franklin was removed from his post as Postmaster General for patriotic tendencies, and John Hancock, Sam Adams, and the Sons of Liberty were proclaimed traitors. The first of the 4 acts against the colonies was the Boston Port Act, passed in March 1774. The law closed the Boston port to all exports and imports until Great Britain was paid reparations for the money lost by the Boston Tea Party. As you might imagine, the colonists refused to submit to the Boston Port Act. So then came the Massachusetts Government Act and the Administration of Justice Act on May 20th. The Massachusetts Government Act superseded the Massachusetts Colonial Charter and placed Massachusetts under direct rule of Parliament and the King. And the law also dissolved all assemblies in Massachusetts and banned new assemblies, committees, and meetings from taking place. Naturally, the people of Massachusetts ignored all of this. The Administration of Justice Act, though, allowed British soldiers and officials to have trials for capital offenses moved to England to be tried. and also gave colonial governors the ability to house British soldiers in unoccupied private buildings. And the last act I will mention was passed in June, the Quartering Act of 1774. This was an extension of the Quartering Act of 1765 that had never been repealed, but Parliament knew that governors feared implementing the previous Quartering Act for fear of violence and riots. So Parliament strengthened the power of the governors by giving them the authority to put up soldiers in private residences without the owner's permission. The so-called logic behind this law was that the governors needed such an overreaching power in order to keep the peace, and it also gave the added benefit of allowing more soldiers to be ready for possible rebellion. That's the logic of it anyways. So those 4 acts are known to the Americans as the Intolerable Acts, and to the British as the Coercive Acts. I have to halt our progress here, though, to give you the British explanation and point of view. Just to be fair, because this is the last real opportunity to show you the British perspective before the War of Independence begins. I'll be quick about it, though. In April, after the Boston Port Act had already passed, Lord North and his ministry was under fire when they proposed the final 3 coercive acts. There had been little to no opposition in the legislature for the Boston Port Act when it was backed and proposed by Lord North and King George. In fact, I would say the Boston Port Act was actually quite justified. That may seem un-American, but to put it in the popular vernacular, when you destroy property and promote rebellious attitudes, you don't deserve to have nice things. So the Port Act made sense, but the new propositions that we've already mentioned, the Administration of Justice Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, and the Quartering Act, did not pass so easily. They met with significant opposition, and the resistance in Parliament was led by 2 extremely well-known and popular politicians, the Irishman Edmund Burke and the Earl of Chatham, William Pitt. They pleaded in the House of Commons for restraint and declared that Britain should not seek retribution, but reconciliation. By the way, they were totally correct in saying that. I don't mean that in a pro-patriot kind of way. I mean that in a political way. Because Burke and Pitt knew the game that the American radicals were playing at. They knew the Sons of Liberty were trying to instigate Britain to overreach. The whole point of the Boston Tea Party and the Sons of Liberty's actions was to provoke Parliament into a massive blunder. I'll put it another way, though, through a metaphor. This will be an animal metaphor, though, so stay with me. In 1774, Great Britain is a lion, and the colonies are like 13 wild animals. For example, I might imagine Virginia is a small, but crazy Wolverine, and if Massachusetts is anything, it's a rabid raccoon with a chip on its shoulder. That's a compliment, by the way. All 13 of these wily animals are friends, but only like casual friends. They don't hang out too much. So the Massachusetts raccoon realized it'd get mauled if it took on the lion of Great Britain alone. Yet the raccoon with the Boston accent was smart. It decided to bait the British lion into angering all 13 animals. So the conniving raccoon staged the Boston Tea Party, where he trashed some of the lion's stuff. The lion figured out who did it, and went by the 13 animals' den, and while he knew it was the raccoon's doing, he decided to punish every animal by issuing the Intolerable Acts. This worked right into the raccoon's plan, though, because now all the animals supported him because the British lion had wronged all of them. Now the Patriot Radicals had a fighting chance because 13 wild animals might have a shot in a fight against a lion. That turned out to be more of an extended simile than a metaphor, but that's enough animal talk. You get the point. Back to Parliament in the spring of 1774. Edmund Burke and Pitt saw the strategy I just explained that the Patriots were going for. They pleaded again and again for the other members of Parliament not to take the bait. And I now enter the debate in the House of Commons. Keep in mind, though, that I'm speeding up the debate action because in reality it took place over a month of talks. On March 22nd, Burke took to the floor echoing a previous speech of his from January. I'll try and do him justice. Quote, "Again and again revert to your own principles. Seek peace and ensue it. Leave America to tax herself." End quote. The members then roared in disagreement, shouting about the rights and laws of Parliament. He hushed their clamor, saying, "I am not here going into the distinction of rights, not attempting to mark their boundaries. I do not enter into these metaphysical distinctions. I hate the very sound of them. Leave the Americans as they anciently stood, and these distinctions will die along with it. Be content to bind them by laws of trade. Do not burthen them by taxes. When you drive them hard, the boar will surely turn upon the hunters." End quote. Even Burke used an animal reference. The House of Commons then bursted into a fury yet again, and Lord North descended to the floor to defend the last 3 coercive acts, saying, quote, "The Americans have tarred and feathered your subjects, plundered your merchants, burnt your ships, denied all obedience to your laws and authority. Whatever may be the consequences, we must risk something. If we do not, all is over." The lords chanted in approval, and Burke rose again, screaming for silence. The tide of the noise quieted for a moment, and Burke asked the lords, "If sovereignty and freedom cannot be reconciled, which will they take?" He answered for them, "They will cast your sovereignty in your face. No body of men will be argued into slavery." William Pitt rose in agreement with Burke, but it was to no avail. Despite their popularity, their plans for reconciliation and peace did nothing to change Parliament's mind. The coercive acts were passed by a landslide vote of approval. In America, the Intolerable Acts had united every colony in their disapproval and perhaps even hatred of Parliament. The Committees of Correspondence grew in power monumentally in the summer of 1774, and now most colonists saw their leaders and political representatives as those delegates to the committees. The Patriot leadership knew the committees were limited in their power, though, because they were relatively unknown to the British. They were a shadow government, after all. So the Patriots decided to form a legislature that would officially represent all 13 American colonies. This was the first Continental Congress. It was decided that the Congress would convene in Philadelphia in September. Each colony elected its own representatives. The only colony to not send delegates, though, was Georgia, which had quite a few loyalists. Many future Hall of Fame Americans, as I like to say, were among the delegates as they arrived. Examples include John and Sam Adams, John Jay, George Washington, Richard Henry Lee, John Rutledge, John Sullivan, Roger Sherman, Patrick Henry, and Benjamin Harrison. A pretty successful bunch, I'd say. The Congress convened and they debated how exactly they should handle the predicament they were in. But they couldn't move forward until they were all on the same page. Still, it took weeks of arguing and I assume shouting until they came to a decision. Some had called for rebellion, but cooler heads prevailed. Thus, the First Continental Congress chose reconciliation and compromise with Great Britain by issuing a Declaration of Resolves, as well as a petition to the King that listed the wrongs of Parliament, but still acknowledged the authority of Britain to regulate laws and commerce, but nothing more. The Congress also issued a unilateral boycott of all British goods that would begin in December if the Intolerable Acts were not repealed. This was truthfully the last opportunity to prevent war and rebellion that Great Britain and Parliament had. But despite more arguing in Parliament, both the petition and Declaration of Resolves were ignored by Great Britain. Everything begins to tumble downhill now for any semblance of peace relations between America and Great Britain. George Washington proposed a resolution in Congress requesting that all colonies should begin to form organized militias. Many of the northern colonies took it one step further by installing training programs for their militias. As the year 1775 began, British trade to North America dipped by an astonishing 97%. The colonists now unified themselves under the Patriot cause by now referring to themselves not as Englishmen or colonists, but as Americans. Word of England's refusal to acknowledge the First Continental Congress's pleas came back, and the word rebellion began to be whispered throughout America. Everyone from politicians to farmers to clergymen began to debate the proposition of rebellion. Where was the line between resistance and open rebellion, though? George Washington was uncertain, saying, "I shall not undertake to say where the line between Great Britain and the colonies should be drawn, but I am of an opinion that one ought to be drawn and our rights clearly ascertained." End quote. New England was taking matters seriously. They expected war. They took matters into their own hands and went beyond training soldiers. In December of 1774, Patriots captured Fort William and Mary with no casualties for either side. The Patriots did it to capture cannon and powder reserves, and New Englanders began to stockpile supplies in seemingly random locations, and the Sons of Liberty constructed an information network throughout New England to keep leaders informed of British movements. Certain Patriot leaders such as Samuel Adams and John Hancock also had warrants out for their arrest. War was approaching, and the Patriot leaders were beginning to realize it. Virginia's House of Burgesses was also hesitant to openly train military forces until Patrick Henry gave his famous speech in favor of military mobilization. He ended it saying, "Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God! I know not what course others take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." That was on March 23rd, 1775. In less than a month, blood would be spilled in open conflict. So let's get on with it. On April 18th of the very next month, British forces in Boston were ordered to proceed to Concord with the utmost speed and secrecy during the night. Their objective was to destroy any military supplies and, if discovered, arrest John Hancock and Samuel Adams. The Patriots had prior intelligence of the excursion and put measures into effect to nullify British efforts. Powder supplies were removed, but much was still in danger for the Patriots on the night of April 18th. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Sam Prescott rode that night to warn militias of the British presence. A force of New Englanders then took up arms and shadowed the British movements in the early morning hours. And conflict broke out at dawn on the 19th, and the Battle of Lexington and Concord began. It's still relatively unknown who fired first, but the battle resulted in dozens of casualties and a British tactical withdrawal back to Boston. The news of Lexington and Concord spread like wildfire throughout America. A Second Continental Congress was called, and Ethan Allen, Benedict Arnold, and the Green Mountain Boys seized Fort Ticonderoga in the Hudson River Valley to prevent British reinforcements from descending from Canada. The American War of Independence had begun. Thank you for listening to the show. Remember to rate and review on iTunes and tell your friends.
Thank you, and good night.